Welcome once again to the Brownstone, Wolfe's sanctuary of logic, orchids, and murder. Do tell us where in the world you're listening from, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts. If you enjoy these cases, consider liking and subscribing. Now then, shall we begin? Nero Wolfe and the whisper that shook the Brownstone. It was midnight when the Brownstone's phone rang. In this house, after-hours calls come in 3 flavors: corpses, criminals, or Kramer. You can bet I wasn't pulling on my robe in hopes of a cheery wrong number. I padded into the office barefoot, tied the belt around my waist, and grabbed the receiver before it could rouse Wolfe from the 2nd floor. "Yeah?" I said, pitching it low, ready for a bill collector or a hysterical air. What came through wasn't either. It was a whisper, thin, ragged, urgent, the kind of voice that makes you check whether someone's standing right behind you. "Tell Mr. Wolfe," it said, barely above breath, "the Brownstone isn't safe, not even for him." I straightened. "Who's this?" Silence. Then the faint sound of breath, close to the mouthpiece. I started to press, but the line clicked and went dead. Just like that. I stood there with the receiver in my hand, listening to the dial tone hum like a bored mosquito. Whoever it was hadn't been calling about unpaid rent. They'd been scared enough to whisper like a kid confessing a crime under the bed covers. I hung up and considered my options. 1, pretend I'd dreamed it, head back to bed, and let Wolfe have his 8 hours uninterrupted. 2, play responsible legman and rouse him. Trouble is, Wolfe considers any midnight disturbance an affront to civilization, unless it's his orchids begging for water. Still, you don't get a warning about the Brownstone itself and file it under miscellaneous. So I climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Outside his bedroom I knocked. A groan came through the heavy door. Then his voice, a growl flattened by sleep. "Archie, what?" "We've had a call," I said. "Not social." There was silence, then a heavy sigh. A moment later the latch clicked. Wolfe filled the doorway, a mountain in a maroon dressing gown, his hair rumpled like an untended hedge. He looked at me as though civilization itself had betrayed him. "Explain." I did, word for word. The whisper, the message, the click. He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Phooey," he said. An anonymous whisper is a coward's toy. Still, he opened his eyes, dark and sharp now. "Repeat the words exactly." I did, again, syllable by syllable. He nodded once, pulled the gown tighter, and turned. "We will not discuss it in the hall. Downstairs." By the time we were in the office, I'd flicked on the lamps, and the room looked like a stage waiting for actors. The yellow chair center, the red pair opposite, the big desk, the safe squatting in the corner. The telephone sat on its stand like a guilty witness. Wolfe lowered himself into his chair with a sigh that rattled the upholstery. "Tell me, Archie," he said, voice smoother now, "in what tone was this whisper uttered?" "Frightened," I said. Whoever it was sounded like they'd seen the devil take a stroll across 35th Street. "Bah, hyperbole." He tapped his fingers together. "Nonetheless, the import is clear. A threat. Or a warning, which is merely a threat in masquerade." I grinned. "Look at you, using midnight philosophy." "Spare me your levity. Fetch Fritz." I raised a brow. "You want Fritz awake for this?" "Warm chocolate," Wolfe said firmly. "And milk for you. The stomach steadies the mind." I headed to the kitchen. Fritz appeared in his robe, Swiss dignity intact even with his hair tousled. I explained briefly. He said nothing, but in 5 minutes he had a tray assembled, a steaming pot of chocolate for Wolfe, milk warmed and frothed in a tall glass for me. That man could cook with his eyes shut and both hands tied. Back in the office, Wolfe was sunk in his chair, eyes half closed, breathing slow as though he could will the whisperer into existence. I set the tray down. Fritz poured for him and withdrew, silent as a ghost. I sipped my milk, perched on the edge of the desk. "So, boss, what's our play? Call Kramer and tell him some midnight crank thinks your fortress has termites." Wolfe opened his eyes and fixed me with the look he reserves for particularly stupid insects. "No, we inform no one, not yet." He lifted the cup, inhaled the steam, and drank. "The Brownstone is inviolate. To hint otherwise is insolence, but unless evidence manifests, this remains vapor." "Meaning we wait?" "Precisely." "Fine," I said. "But if I wake up to find dynamite under the stoop, don't say I didn't vote for action." He grunted, which in Wolfian means both "you're impertinent" and "point taken." He set his cup down and steepled his fingers. "You will record nothing of this call in the casebook." I blinked. "That's not like you." "It is like me," he said coldly. "An event without substance is not an event. A whisper is not a fact. You will remember it, as will I, but it will not sully the record." I leaned back, balancing my glass. "So officially, it never happened. Unofficially, it's keeping you awake." He shot me a glance sharp enough to nick glass. "Archie, enough." That was my cue. I finished the milk, set the glass down, and watched him sink deeper into thought. He sat there like a general in a fortress, calculating unseen troop movements. The whisper had reached the only place Wolfe ever called sacred: his house, his chair, his walls. If there's one thing that can get under his skin, it's the suggestion that the Brownstone isn't safe. The clock ticked past 1. The lamps threw long shadows across the rug, making the place look like a set for a play that hadn't yet been written. I stood, stretched, and said, "You sure you don't want me to keep the phone by my bed, just in case our phantom likes encores?" "No," he said, eyes closed again. "If he calls, let him whisper to emptiness. We will wait until he dares materialize." And that was it. Wolfe retreated upstairs, Fritz reclaimed the tray, and I was left in the office staring at the telephone like it might jump. A whisper in the night had shaken the Brownstone, even if Wolfe wouldn't admit it. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that when whispers start, corpses usually follow. Morning at the Brownstone usually comes in layers, like a well-constructed pastry. Fritz clattering softly below in his kitchen kingdom, the faint shuffle of Wolfe upstairs with his breakfast tray, and the orchids demanding their 2 hours of ritual attention between 9 and 11. My job in those hours is mostly to keep the world from leaking in, because nothing irritates Wolfe more than being interrupted while he's contemplating his orchids' social lives. That morning, I had the office to myself. The sun fought its way through the curtains in lazy stripes, landing on the desk where I sat wrestling with correspondence and bills that Wolfe would never answer or pay until absolutely required. I had just decided that a man in my position deserved a glass of milk to fortify him when the doorbell rang. Now, Fritz doesn't answer doors, not if the house was burning down and the firemen were polite enough to ring first. That left me. I went, and when I opened the door, my first impression was that someone had ordered a burst of Technicolor for our otherwise black-and-white existence. She stood there in a crimson dress that fit like it had been poured. Dark hair swept up, eyes sharp but shadowed with worry. She wasn't young enough to be naive, not old enough to be resigned. She carried herself like a woman who had been looked at too much and trusted too little. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. Her voice was low, trained, the kind that lingers after the words are gone. "That's me, and you're here to see Mr. Wolfe, I take it?" "Yes, Genevieve Harrow." She glanced past me as though measuring the Brownstone's bones. "He is expecting callers?" "Expecting? No. Accepting? That depends on what you've brought in your handbag. Come on in." I led her to the office, gave her the red chair. Wolfe wasn't downstairs yet, but punctuality is one of his few virtues. At 11 sharp, right on schedule, I heard the tread of his feet on the stairs. He came in, crisp in brown silk and bulk, eyes flicking to our visitor. "Mrs. Harrow," I said. "Genevieve." She wanted a word. Wolfe lowered himself into his yellow chair, leaned back and closed his eyes halfway like a man preparing to tolerate a thunderstorm. "Proceed," he said. She licked her lips. Her composure looked ironclad from a distance, but up close you could see the cracks. "Mr. Wolfe, I am in danger of ruin. Someone is blackmailing me." I raised a brow, but Wolfe didn't stir. He merely lifted one hand slightly. "State the facts, succinctly." "My husband, he is dead these 2 years, left behind entanglements, financial, debts and dealings of questionable propriety. I've done what I can to preserve his name, but 2 nights ago I was approached on the street. A man. He said he knew everything. He demanded money." "Describe him." "Thin, pale, spectacles. His voice—" She faltered, then forced the words out. "He spoke in a whisper, so faint I almost leaned closer to hear. He told me my late husband's accounts were known to him, that unless I paid he would go to the authorities." That got my attention. I leaned forward. "A whispery voice, you say?" She nodded, eyes flicking to me, uncertain. I didn't look at Wolfe, but I could feel him tightening, like a cat that pretends to sleep while the bird hops closer. He said, "And you have not yet paid?" "No, I have delayed." I hoped perhaps he was bluffing, but then last night there was a letter, slipped under my door. It said if I did not deliver the money soon, I would regret it. "Have you brought this letter?" "Yes." She opened her handbag and produced a folded sheet, hands trembling only slightly. I took it, gave it the once-over, typed, all capitals, blunt, "Tomorrow or everything comes out." I passed it to Wolfe. He read, grunted, and set it on the desk like it was a menu for food he would never order. "Why me?" he asked. Her lips thinned. "Because they mentioned your name." That did it. Wolfe opened his eyes fully, and his voice dropped an octave. "Explain." "The man, this clerk," he said the Brownstone itself was not safe, that even you could not protect me if I resisted. Silence stretched. I heard the clock tick, the faint hum of a car on the street outside. Wolfe sat absolutely still, eyes hooded. For him, that was the equivalent of a man banging his fist on the table. I cleared my throat. "That lines up with something else, boss. We had a midnight call last night. Whispered voice, warning about the Brownstone not being safe. Hung up before I could ask his shoe size." Wolfe turned his gaze on me, heavy as an anvil. "You did not record it." "You told me not to," I reminded him. "Phooey." He looked back at Mrs. Harrow. "Madam, you are certain it was the same voice?" "Yes." He tapped his fingers together. "Very well. I will accept your case. Not for your late husband's honour, which I hold in little esteem, nor for your equanimity, which is tenuous. I will accept because my house has been named." Relief spilled across her face, quickly smoothed over. She straightened her back, meeting his gaze. "Then you will help me?" "I will inquire," he corrected. "Whether help will emerge depends on what is unearthed." She inclined her head. "That is all I ask." Wolfe flicked his eyes at me. "Archie, obtain every detail possible of her husband's affairs. Past business associates, firms, clerks. Begin with law clerks." "Law clerks it is," I said. "Any you recommend in particular, Mrs. Harrow?" She hesitated. "There was one, Morton Kelland, a law clerk who worked for my husband's firm, years ago. He was dismissed, though I don't know why. He is the one who stopped me on the street." That was a neat bow on the package. Morton Kelland, clerk with a whisper, ghosting around our Brownstone and calling me in the middle of the night. Wolfe leaned back, half shut his eyes again, and pressed his fingertips together. "Leave the letter. You will hear from me." She rose. Even in movement, she carried that crimson aura like a warning light. She gathered her handbag, smoothed her skirt, and looked from Wolfe to me. "Thank you." I saw her out, watching the crimson vanish down the steps into the bright Manhattan day. When I came back, Wolfe was studying the letter as though it might sprout roots and bloom into a confession. "Interesting," he murmured. "More than interesting," I said, perching on the desk. "Last night's whisperer and today's blackmailer share a voice. Our new client thinks she's protecting her late husband's reputation, but what she's really done is drag us into a whisper war." He didn't answer, just rang for Fritz. A moment later, Fritz appeared, immaculate now in his whites, carrying the noon beer on a tray, frosted glass, amber liquid, foam whispering against the rim. Wolfe took it, drank, and set the glass down with precision. "Archie," he said, "we have been challenged, and challenges must be met." He closed his eyes again, as though already arranging the battlefield inside his head. "I've tailed a fair share of women out of Wolfe's office, but usually it's because they're lying, hiding, or planning something that'll bite us later. Genevieve Harrow, crimson dress and all, practically advertised trouble in neon. Wolfe had accepted her case with all the reluctance of a man agreeing to eat turnips, which meant the legwork was mine. He'd gone back to his orchids. I went after her. She left the Brownstone just shy of noon, head high, gloved hand clutching her bag as though it might shield her from the street. Manhattan rewarded her with its usual orchestra, honking horns, hissing brakes, a cop's whistle slicing through the racket. I stayed a good half-block back, letting the crowd absorb me. The rain had started again, steady and mean, slicking the sidewalk so every neon sign bled itself across puddles. It wasn't enough to keep people indoors. This was New York, after all, but it gave everything a sheen, like the city had been dipped in oil. I wasn't alone. Saul Pantzer had joined in, summoned by phone before Mrs. Harrow even left our red chair. He melted into the scenery the way only Saul can. If you weren't looking for him, you'd never see him. The old flat cap was in place, pulled low. He didn't wave, didn't even nod, just slid into the opposite side of the street, pacing Genevieve from another angle. With Saul along, I felt better, which, in my line of work, is like saying you feel better about going over Niagara in a barrel if it's reinforced with steel. We followed her south on 7th, then east. She wasn't shopping, not with that tight jaw. She wasn't strolling either. She was heading somewhere with purpose, glancing behind her now and then but never spotting me. She did, however, miss another set of eyes on her. I caught him first near Herald Square. Thin fellow, nervous shoulders hunched against the rain. His shoes slapped the wet pavement like they were trying to escape his feet. He had a pair of spectacles that flashed every time a headlight caught them, and the kind of jerky walk that said he'd had more coffee than confidence. He kept Genevieve in sight, ducking whenever she slowed. I angled closer, letting my trench coat collar do most of the hiding. Across the street, Saul clocked him too. I could tell by the slight hitch in his stride the way his head angled without turning. Genevieve ducked into a department store entrance out of the rain. She paused there as though deciding her next move. Our spectacled friend paused too, fumbling with his coat pocket. Saul made his move, slipping in from the corner, easy as a man just out for cigarettes. But the fellow was quicker than he looked. He spotted Saul's shadow coming and bolted, weaving through a clutch of umbrellas. By the time I pushed across traffic, Saul was already after him. Horns blared, a cabbie cursed, and someone dropped a package that burst open on the wet street. I caught a glimpse of the thin man's back as he dodged around the corner. Saul followed, but when I reached it a moment later, both were gone into the river of people. Manhattan's good at swallowing men whole. Genevieve had slipped out too, either into the store or a cab. I swore under my breath, scanning the sidewalks, but no dice. Saul reappeared 10 minutes later, calm as if he'd just been window shopping. He handed me something small, folded and damp from the rain. "Dropped it," he said simply. I unfolded it. A scrap of paper, torn from a notebook, pencil scrawls smudged but legible. "Whisper Room, 11 p.m. I let out a low whistle. "Well, well, our whisperer has a reservation." Saul only adjusted his cap. "You'll want to tell Wolfe." "Yeah, he'll be tickled pink," I said. "But first, we dry off before this ink runs into poetry." We headed back toward the Brownstone. The city roared around us, neon and rain conspiring to make the sidewalks gleam like wet steel. I kept turning the scrap over in my pocket, feeling the weight of it despite its size. A whisper in the night was one thing, but now we had a place and a time. The Whisper Room, 11 sharp. And when a man goes around leaving breadcrumbs that neat, it usually means he's hoping someone will follow. Back in the office, Wolfe was in his yellow chair, looking like a king halfway between ruling and napping. The orchids had had their morning sermon, and Fritz had just served him the first beer of the day, condensation frosting the glass. I tossed the scrap onto his desk. Souvenir from our shadow. He dropped it while Saul was trying to shake his hand. Wolfe picked it up delicately, as though afraid it might soil him. He read it once, lips tightening. "Whisper Room," he repeated. "A nightclub. Crude." "Sure, but convenient. Our boy likes his drama. 11 p.m. appointment tonight." He set the paper down, reached for his beer and took a measured sip. "Archie, I abhor nightclubs. They are dens of cacophony. But you will go." "Of course I will," I said. "If anyone's going to sip whiskey and listen to bad saxophones, it ought to be me. You, meanwhile, can sit here and glare the wallpaper into submission." "Pfui. Go, observe, report, and take Saul." I grinned. "Naturally. He blends better with neon than you do." Wolfe ignored me, which was his way of saying I'd scored a hit. He closed his eyes and tapped the desk with one finger. "This thin man, did you see him closely?" Close enough to admire his eyewear. Nervous, twitchy, about one step from breaking into a run. And yes, he was trailing Mrs. Harrow like a moth on a string. Wolfe opened his eyes, dark as coffee. "Then we are on the verge of congruence. The whisper to you, the whisper to her, the Whisper Room itself. It is not happenstance, it is orchestration." "Well," I said, leaning back in my chair, Then tonight, maestro, we find out who's conducting. Fritz came in just then, announcing lunch in his polite Swiss way. The smell from the kitchen hit me like a reward. Veal with herbs, if my nose wasn't lying. Wolfe heaved himself up, the case momentarily shelved for food. But even as he went, I noticed his eyes linger once more on the scrap of paper. For Wolfe, that meant the Whisperer had succeeded in one thing. He'd breached the Brownstone not with dynamite, but with a note written in pencil. The Whisper Room wasn't the kind of joint you stumble into by accident, unless your compass needle points to trouble. I got there a shade before 11, trenchcoat collar turned up against the drizzle, and handed my hat to a kid at the door who looked like he'd pawn it if I left a nickel in the band. Inside, the place was smoke and velvet, jazz curling through the air like a snake charmer's tune. Saxophones bled their hearts out, a trumpet moaned, and somewhere in the back a clarinet wailed like it had just lost its best girl. The decor was a designer's dream after 3 martinis. Red booths sunk deep enough to lose a senator, brass railings polished to a blind, and a dance floor crowded with couples clinging like shipwreck survivors. The lighting was moody enough to make everyone beautiful if you squinted, and I squinted plenty. I took a stool at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and scanned. Bartenders in this town have memories longer than the Brooklyn Bridge, so I slid mine a smile and a buck tip. "Keep the glass heavy," I said. He nodded once, the kind of nod that says, "I'll remember your face if it comes up in court." I didn't have to wait long. In through the haze came Genevieve Harrow, crimson again, like a drop of blood moving through the smoke. She carried herself the same as in Wolfe's office, brittle spine, practiced poise, but with something coiled tight beneath it. She didn't see me, or pretended not to. Instead, she aimed straight for the bar's far end. I let her settle before sliding off my stool and drifting into the shadows. That's when I saw him. Thin, nervous, spectacles catching the low light, our alley phantom from the day before. He was at the bar, nursing a glass that looked more like a prop than a drink. When Genevieve reached him, the change in her was instant. She leaned close, words quick, hand tight on her bag. I moved to a booth just near enough where the smoke covered me, but their voices carried in scraps between saxophone cries. "You can't keep hounding me," she hissed. "You think you have a choice?" His voice was low, strained, and, yes, whispery, the same timbre that had crawled through my receiver at midnight. "Your husband's books are filth. The Brownstone won't protect you. Not even Wolfe can." That got my pulse jogging. So the Whisperer wasn't just a crank. He knew where to jab, and he wanted it known. Genevieve's hand trembled on her glass. "You overestimate yourself." He leaned closer, spectacles glinting. "Do I? The Brownstone is no fortress. It will crack, and when it does, you will fall with it." That was my cue, but I held. No sense spooking him before I had a line. I flagged the bartender, muttered for a refill, and kept my ears tuned. She said something I missed under the band's swell. He stiffened, eyes darting around the room. For a second I thought he'd spotted me, but his gaze slid past. He pushed off the bar and moved toward the back, shoulders hunched. Genevieve stayed put, breathing shallow, like a diver clinging to the last gulp of air. I debated tailing him then and there, but instinct said hold. Instead, I slid out, strolled casual, and paused at Genevieve's elbow. "Evening," I said, smooth as I could manage over the racket. "Didn't expect to see you here. Nice night for whispers." Her head jerked up, the mask cracked. Fear, raw and quick before she pulled it back. "Mr. Goodwin, you? What are you doing here?" "Sampling the jazz," I said, "and the company, though I'd say your date left early." She tried for frost but got only mist. "That man, he follows me. He's dangerous." I leaned in. "He also thinks Wolfe's house is up for demolition. I'd call that dangerous too." Her eyes flicked sideways, the way people do when truth and lies are arm wrestling. "I don't know why he says these things." "Sure," I said lightly. "And I don't know why bartenders water the whiskey, but it happens. Now, unless you'd like a police escort, I suggest you stick close. He won't be gone long." She rose, clutching her bag, but before she could move, the band shifted gears, louder, brassier. The floor filled, couples swirling, lights pulsing. In the chaos, the thin man reappeared, slipping toward the exit. This time I followed. I caught sight of Saul in the crowd, flat cap low, eyes steady. He'd tailed me here, like we'd planned, and now gave a minute nod before angling to cut the man off from the side. But Spectacles was slippery. He darted past the coat check, through a side door, and into the rain-slick alley. By the time we hit the street, he was already swallowed in the neon-soaked dark. Saul cursed softly, a rare treat. Fast. "Yeah," I said, scanning the empty alley. Trash cans, puddles, the glow of a flickering sign. "But not invisible. We'll net him." Saul's eyes flicked to me. "What did he say inside?" "Enough to give Wolfe indigestion. He knows about the Brownstone, claims it'll crack wide open, told Genevieve straight to her face." Saul grunted, which in Panzer speak meant he didn't like it. Neither did I. We circled back inside, but Genevieve was gone too, vanished into the crowd, or the night. That left us with smoke, music, and the aftertaste of a whisper. By the time I got back to the Brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, bulk settled in the yellow chair, Fritz hovering with the late-night chocolate service. The office smelled of cocoa and orchids, a peculiar combination, but home all the same. "Well?" Wolfe demanded. I tossed my hat on the rack. "The Whisper Room lives up to its name. Your client was there, arguing with a fellow in spectacles. Same one we've been tracking. He told her, and anyone listening, that the Brownstone's no fortress, that it'll crack. His voice matches our midnight phantom to the last breath." Wolfe's nostrils flared, a sign of deep displeasure. He sipped chocolate, set the cup down with deliberate care, and said, "Archie, this has gone beyond insolence. It is provocation. Tomorrow, you and Mr. Panzer will tighten the noose. For now, bed." I grinned despite the weight in my gut. Sure, I'll dream of velvet booths and saxophones. But even as I climbed the stairs, I knew there'd be no easy sleep. Once whispers start naming the Brownstone, they have a way of turning into shouts, and shouts in this city usually end with bodies. New York alleys have a way of telling you what they are before you've taken 2 steps into them. This one reeked of cabbage gone wrong, cheap gin, and the damp kind of darkness that makes you wonder how many lives have been emptied out on its stones. I hadn't planned on a tour, but when you leave a nightclub where the band plays like it's strangling brass and a whisperer slips out into the rain, you follow. I'd missed him once already that night. This time, fate took care of it for me. Halfway down the alley, sprawled between a couple of battered trash cans, was the thin man in spectacles. Except now the spectacles were askew on his face, one lens cracked into a spiderweb. His tie was cinched so tight around his throat that you didn't need a diploma in medicine to sign the death certificate. Whoever had throttled him had done it quick and done it mean. The rain spattered down, washing grime into rivulets, glinting off the puddles that pooled around his shoulders. Neon from the club's sign flickered red and blue across him, like a sick parody of police lights. I crouched down, checked for a pulse I knew wasn't there, and muttered to myself, "Well, pal, you whispered too long." Voices rose behind me. A pair of bystanders had followed the same scent of curiosity. One gasped, another bolted. That was all the cue the city needed. Within minutes, the alley was buzzing, and then came the inevitable. A squad car, 2 uniforms, and finally, storming in with cigar clenched like it was part of his anatomy, Inspector Kramer. He saw me first, naturally. His eyes narrowed until they could have split a hair. "Goodwin!" he barked, voice rough as gravel. "Why the hell is it always you?" I stood, brushing rain off my sleeve. "Coincidence, Inspector. I was out for the nightlife, same as you. Only difference is I didn't bring a squad car." He shoved past me to the body, bent low, grunted. "Strangled. Tie, no less. Cute." He straightened, cigar shifting from one corner of his mouth to the other. "You were tailing him." "Not tailing. More like keeping an eye on a fellow citizen. You know me. Civic-minded." "Don't get smart. You saw who did it?" "Afraid not. Walked out, found him gift-wrapped. Killer must have slipped through while the band was hitting its high note." Kramer spat smoke, glared. "And the woman? The one you were jawing with at the bar? Where's she?" I shrugged. "Genevieve Harrow? She went missing about the same time. Maybe she had to powder her nose." He grunted again, this one with less patience. "Every damn time. Bodies drop, and you're standing over them with that grin. Someday I'll nail you for obstruction, Goodwin, and I'll enjoy it." "You'll have to get in line," I said pleasantly. The uniforms were busy frisking the stiff. One of them called out, "Inspector, something in the pocket." Kramer stepped over, yanked a folded sheet from the man's coat. He opened it, squinted through cigar smoke, then stopped dead. His eyes cut to me. "Well, Goodwin, care to explain why your boss's name is on this?" I moved closer. Sure enough, the letter was addressed, bold and clear, to Nero Wolfe. "Guess he was a fan," I said lightly. Kramer jammed the paper into his own pocket. He didn't hand me a copy then, but later at the precinct, after 10 minutes of mutual growling, he let me make one, "Don't get cute, whatever this is, Wolfe's tied in. You tell him I want answers and fast, or I'll drag him out of that brownstone of his even if I have to use a tow truck." That image alone almost made the night worthwhile, Wolfe being hauled out past his orchids kicking and roaring. Almost. "Don't get your blood pressure up, Inspector," I said. "I'll deliver the message, but you'll forgive me if I don't bet money on Wolfe being thrilled about a corpse sending him fan mail." He jabbed a finger at me. "One slip, Goodwin. Just one, and I'll pin this whole mess on you." "Sure," I said. "Get in line for that too." The rain thickened. The alley smelled of wet wool and cheap perfume, like the city was laughing at us. The uniforms zipped the thin man into a bag, glasses and all, and hauled him off like yesterday's garbage. Kramer stomped away, muttering curses at the world in general and me in particular. When it was finally quiet again, I lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall. The smoke curled into the damp air, mixing with the ghost of the saxophone still bleeding out from the club. A whisperer strangled by his own tie, a letter to Wolfe tucked in his pocket, and a client who disappeared faster than champagne on New Year's. I ground the cigarette out under my heel, pulled my collar up, and headed back to West 35th Street. The brownstone was quiet when I got there, lamplight glowing in the windows like a fortress against the night. Inside, Fritz had the kitchen smelling of herbs and broth, preparing Wolfe's midnight snack in case civilization demanded it. Wolfe himself was in his yellow chair, a fresh beer at hand, eyes closed as though he were meditating on the human race's capacity for stupidity. He opened one eye when I came in. "You are damp," he observed. "Rain does that," I said. "Also corpses in alleys." Both eyes opened now, and he sat up an inch. "Explain." I did, short and to the point. Thin man in spectacles, strangled with his tie. Kramer, furious. And the kicker, the letter addressed to Wolfe, pulled from the body's pocket. At that, Wolfe's brows drew down. He lifted his beer, sipped, set it down hard enough to make the foam shiver. A corpse carrying my name. Intolerable. "You're telling me," I said. "Kramer practically offered to gift wrap you for the grand jury. Wants answers fast." Wolfe snorted. "Kramer wants simplicity, which he will not have. He may fume." "Fine," I said. "But this is no longer just whispers and clients in red dresses. Somebody strangled our midnight caller, and they wanted you in the middle of it." He closed his eyes again, fingers steepled. "So be it. The challenge is issued. We will respond." I headed for the kitchen, figuring milk would be as good a nightcap as any. Fritz handed me a glass without asking, eyes mild, as though murders were as routine as soufflés. Back in the office, Wolfe was silent, thinking. The rain drummed on the windows, steady as a funeral march. And me, I sat with my milk, staring at the dark glass, wondering how many more whispers the city had left before it screamed. The brownstone had a particular way of greeting you when you came in late. The street outside could be howling with drunks, rain, and sirens, but once the front door clicked shut, the house pulled everything tight, like a fortress closing its gates. That night, though, the fortress felt compromised. Maybe it was the weight in my pocket, the folded sheet of paper I'd copied from Kramer's file, or maybe it was the fact that a corpse had carried Wolfe's name against its chest. Either way, I didn't like the silence of the hall as I hung my coat and hat. It was too expectant, as if the walls were waiting for news. Upstairs, I heard the faint shuffle of Wolfe retreating from the plant rooms. Orchids don't argue, but they do demand, and Wolfe never cheated them of their 2-hour sermon. By the time he reached the office, I had the lamps low, the letter ready on his blotter, and my nerves strung tighter than Fritz's violin wire. Wolfe entered, heavy steps shaking the stair, and lowered himself into the yellow chair with all the grace of a king returning to a throne after exile. His eyes flicked to me, then to the folded sheet. "You have something," he said. His tone was level, but I knew that tone, like a surface of ice hiding a furnace beneath. Yeah, I told him. Something dropped out of our whisperer's pocket before someone decided to turn him into alley trash. A letter, addressed to you. His brows lifted, then drew down. He extended a hand. I gave it over, watching his thick fingers unfold the paper. He read silently, lips tightening, then let out a sound that was more growl than word. The letter was simple enough. Abandon this. Another body is nothing to us. It can be yours next. It wasn't signed unless you count arrogance as a signature. Wolfe folded the sheet again, very carefully, as though folding it smaller might strangle the insult out of it. He set it down with precise distaste, then leaned back, eyes narrowing. Archie, he said, voice low and clipped, this is insolence of the rankest order. Sure, I said, leaning against the desk. But it's also a pretty good threat. Somebody out there thinks they can scare you into folding your tent. Phooey, the word cracked like a whip. My tent is not so easily collapsed. They threaten me in my own house. They sully my name with a corpse. He broke off, nostrils flaring. Fritz arrived just then, silent as always, bearing salvation on a tray. 2 chilled glasses, a dark bottle of beer opened, foam glistening. He set it with ceremony at Wolfe's elbow, poured with Swiss precision, and offered me my own glass of milk without my asking. The aromas of yeast and malt curled through the tension, a reminder that civilization still existed somewhere in the room. Wolfe lifted the beer, drained half in one pull, then slammed the glass down hard enough to rattle the desk. Archie, he said, this is war. I raised my glass of milk in salute. Then we'd better know who the enemy is. He ignored me, as usual when my humour intruded on his thunder. He sat forward, thick forearms on the chair arms, eyes burning. Someone presumes that I may be coerced, that my sanctuary may be violated, that they may hurl corpses and threats at my door, and I will cower. They err profoundly. I took a long drink and watched him. I've seen Wolfe furious before, clients who lied, police who barged, ingredients Fritz couldn't procure. But this was different. This was fury tempered into steel. Okay, I said. So what's the next play? We've got one dead whisperer, a client who walks in red dresses and out of nightclubs, and now a letter telling you to mind your own business or join the stiff in the alley. That's not exactly a roadmap. His eyes flicked to me, sharp as a blade. Saul. Saul, I agreed. You want him running shadows? Indeed. Mr. Panther will pursue the tendrils of this affront. He will not be obtrusive. He will observe, and he will report. You will mobilize him immediately. Fine. And what about the others? Fred, Ori? He paused, considered, then shook his head. Not yet. Too many hands may muddle the stew. Saul's discretion is paramount. If expansion is required, we shall engage. Got it, I said. Saul gets the first dance. Wolfe leaned back again, fingers steepled. And you, Archie, will pursue Mrs. Harrow. She is entangled. That much is plain. You will follow, you will question, you will insinuate, but you will not alarm her. Yet. She's already alarmed, I reminded him. I saw her face when Specs told her the Brownstone wasn't a fortress. She was halfway to pieces. Then you must keep her from crumbling entirely. She is a thread, Archie. Pull it carefully. I nodded. The rain tapped against the window, steady, insistent. The lamps threw long shadows across the rug, stretching like fingers toward Wolfe's chair. He looked carved from granite, immovable. Boss, I said, you realize this isn't just some penny ante blackmail game anymore. Whoever's behind this knows you, knows the house, knows how to get under your skin. That's dangerous. His lips thinned. It is intolerable, and therefore it must be destroyed. We let the silence ride for a minute. Fritz had vanished back to his kitchen, leaving the faint scents of broth and herbs in his wake. The beer bottle gleamed half-empty on the tray. Wolfe stared at the folded letter as though he could will it into dust. Finally, I said, Want me to let Kramer in on this? His eyes snapped to me. No. No? Absolutely not. Inspector Kramer is a blunt instrument. His involvement now would cloud matters, and I will not grant him the satisfaction of believing me vulnerable. He will learn what he needs, when he needs it. I shrugged. He's going to be sore. He already thinks you're playing hide-and-seek with evidence. Phooey, he always thinks that. Yeah, But this time, he might be right. Wolfe's glare was volcanic enough to toast marshmallows. Archie. Okay. I held up my hands. Saul gets the shadows. I get the lady. Kramer gets nothing but indigestion. Fine. Just don't say I didn't warn you when he comes knocking with steam pouring out his ears. Wolfe closed his eyes again, drained the rest of his beer, and signalled for another with the tiny bell he kept on the desk. Fritz would hear it, wherever he was. I leaned back in my chair, milk glass empty, and studied him. He was at war now, not just with whoever strangled Morton Kelland, but with the insult itself. The Brownstone was his world, and someone had dared to breach it with whispers, threats, and corpses. That was enough to turn Wolfe's fury volcanic, and when Wolfe erupts, it isn't pretty. The rain outside drummed harder, like the city knew it was heading into a storm of its own. There are few sounds more distinctive than Inspector Kramer storming the Brownstone. The bell doesn't just ring, it quivers like it's been jabbed by a man who doesn't knock, he assaults. I was at my desk with the mid-morning mail when the vibrations rattled the front hall. Fritz, true to form, didn't budge from his kitchen kingdom, which left me to play butler. When I opened the door, Kramer was chewing a cigar like it owed him rent. His hat was jammed low, his coat dripping from the drizzle outside. "Goodwin," he barked, "move." "Always a pleasure," I said, stepping aside. "Wipe your feet. Fritz keeps a clean house." He grunted, marched straight past me, and shouldered into Wolfe's office without waiting for an invitation. If the house was a fortress, then Kramer was the only man who thought he had a permanent pass. Wolfe was behind his desk in the yellow chair, hands folded, eyes half shut. Orchids perfumed the room faintly from his morning upstairs. He didn't even look up as Kramer barged in. "Inspector," Wolfe said, voice smooth as chilled cream, "what calamity propels you?" Kramer planted himself in front of the desk, feet spread, cigar waving like a weapon. "Don't play dumb. You're sitting on evidence again. Morton Kelland's corpse had your name in his pocket, and now I've got a link tying your client to the whisper room. You gonna talk?" Wolfe sighed, opened his eyes a fraction. "Mr. Kelland's unfortunate demise does not make me an accessory, nor does your ceaseless suspicion render me culpable. As for Mrs. Harrow—" "Don't you start smoothing this over," Kramer snapped. He slapped a folder on the desk. Papers slid out, one marked with the whisper room's embossed letterhead. "This is from the club's books. You know what it shows? Genevieve Harrow has an open account there. Big one. Paid in cash. And your boy Panzer's already been sniffing around. So don't tell me you're not involved." Wolfe's brows drew down. He reached for the paper, read, then set it aside as if it were a recipe for boiled cabbage. "An account proves she patronizes a nightclub, Inspector. That is scarcely a revelation, unless you wish to arrest half of Midtown." Kramer growled. "Cut the cute talk. She was seen there last night with Kelland before he got himself strangled. She argued with him. Witnesses confirm. Now he's dead, and she's vanished. You're protecting her." I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the clash. Wolfe in repose against Kramer in full storm was better than a matinee. "Careful, Inspector," I said. "Your blood pressure." "Shut up, Goodwin," Kramer barked. "Always so affectionate," I muttered. Wolfe lifted a hand, silencing both of us. "Inspector, Mrs. Harrow retained me because she was being blackmailed. That much is fact. Beyond that, you leap to conclusions with the vigour of a kangaroo. If she quarrelled with Kelland, it may have been about precisely that. But you imply complicity in murder without evidence." "I've got enough," Kramer shot back. "And if you're withholding so much as a grocery list, I'll have you dragged into court." Wolfe's lips pressed together. Then he rang the little bell on his desk. Fritz appeared a moment later, bearing a tray with beer in chilled glasses. Wolfe accepted his with a nod, poured slowly, and sipped, ignoring the inspector's scowl. I got a glass of milk slid across to me, and I raised it in salute. Kramer jabbed his cigar in Wolfe's direction. "That's your answer? Beer and smugness? You should," Wolfe interrupted. "Seek the truth where it lies. You are being manipulated. Someone has orchestrated events to place Mrs. Harrow under suspicion and me under duress. They have succeeded in provoking you. They will be delighted if you continue to expend your ire upon us rather than upon them." Kramer's face reddened. "You've always got a theory, never the facts. Just fat words sitting in that chair while bodies drop." I cut in. Hey, he moves, twice a day. Orchids and meals, don't cheat him. Kramer swung on me, but Wolfe spoke over him. Facts, Inspector, will reveal themselves in time. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harrow's account at a nightclub proves little beyond indulgence. Your evidence is circumstantial and weak. It's enough to hold her, Kramer snapped. Then do so, Wolfe said evenly. If she is guilty, I will know. If she is not, you will waste resources. Either way, your bluster is unavailing here. The silence that followed was thick enough to slice. The rain tapped against the windows, a steady, irritating drum. Kramer puffed hard on his cigar, smoke clouding the air like battlefield fog. Finally, he shoved the papers back into his folder. You keep dancing around it, Wolfe, but sooner or later I'll pin you and I'll enjoy it. Wolfe drained the rest of his beer and set the glass down with a definitive clink. Your enjoyment is immaterial. Kramer spun on his heel, muttering curses, and stomped out. The front door slammed, rattling the glass in its frame. For a moment, the office was quiet again. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, breathing slow, reclaiming his fortress. I sipped my milk, savouring the calm after the storm. Well, I said, that was fun. He's got a point, though. Genevieve's tied to that club, Kellan's dead, and she's scarce. Looks bad. Wolfe opened one eye. Appearances deceive. We are nearer the heart of this than he suspects, and he is blind because his fury consumes him. Yeah, I said, but fury with handcuffs still gets results. Then we must be swifter, Wolfe replied. Saul is watching. You will press further with Mrs. Harrow's associates. We will not permit Kramer's clumsy grasp to choke the truth. I nodded, leaned back and let the orchid's faint perfume drift in. The fortress held, for now. But outside, the storm was building, and sooner or later, even Kramer's bark would sound like thunder. Dusk had a way of putting its fingerprints on the brownstone. The light slid in through the tall office windows like a thief casing the joint, leaving the corners full of shadows that promised to stick around long after the lamps came on. Fritz had outdone himself in the kitchen, roast duck with a cherry glaze, asparagus stalks so precise they could have been measured with calipers, and potatoes that steamed when the lids lifted. All of it sat untouched on the dining table in the next room, because Wolfe had declared the meal secondary to a performance. When Wolfe calls something a performance, you can bet it's going to be theatrical. We were waiting on our star, Genevieve Harrow. Wolfe had summoned her back on the pretense that progress had been made, and she had agreed, perhaps because her nerves were fraying, or perhaps because curiosity is a leash that drags even the proud. She arrived just as the street lamps blinked on, crimson dress traded for black silk that shimmered like oil in the dim light. Her eyes were tired, but her chin was held high. When I opened the door and ushered her inside, she swept in with the dignity of a woman accustomed to people staring, even if she was starting to suspect the stares were knives. Mrs. Harrow, I said, gesturing toward the office. The ringmaster awaits. She stiffened but entered, and there he was, Wolfe in his yellow chair, broad as a mountain, fingers steepled. The lamps behind him threw a glow that made him look carved from stone. The red chair across from him waited like a snare. Madam, Wolfe said, inclining his head. Sit. She did, smoothing her skirt, eyes darting once around the room, lingering on me at the side, then settling back on him. You said there was news, she began. There is. Wolfe's voice was smooth, deliberate. But before I impart it, you must indulge my need for precision. Words must be exact, or they are worthless. You understand? Yes, she said faintly. Good. Then let us speak plainly. Your late husband's affairs, messy, obscure, perhaps even criminal, are no longer private. Someone has unearthed them. Someone has used them to press you. That man, Morton Kelland, is now dead. Strangled. Her eyes widened a fraction, but she schooled her features quickly. I had nothing to do with that. No one has accused you, Wolfe said mildly. Not yet. But the noose that silenced him lies coiled in your path. You see, blackmail is not tidy. It breeds complications, entanglements, corpses. And now, he gestured toward the folded paper on his desk, a letter has arrived, carrying my name, warning me off. That is galling, unforgivable. She shifted, fingers clenching her handbag. You think I sent it? I think nothing. I know only that you are involved. The degree, the manner, those are what I seek. I leaned against the edge of my desk, watching her. The room felt like a stage, Wolfe as the judge, Genevieve as the defendant, me as the bailiff with a wisecrack for every line. Fritz entered briefly, silent, to set a tray with Wolfe's beer on the side table and my milk beside it. He retreated again, leaving only the faint aroma of roast duck as a reminder of what we were neglecting. Wolfe poured, sipped, and regarded her over the rim. "Mrs. Harrow, you knew Kelland. You admitted he approached you, whispered threats. You admitted he demanded money. What you have not admitted is why he believed he had leverage. Blackmail requires knowledge. He had some, but not all." She swallowed. "I told you. He had my husband's accounts." "Yes," Wolfe murmured. "But which accounts? Which details? Which document?" And there it was, the faintest flicker in her eyes, too quick for most, but not quick enough for Wolfe. Her lips parted. "The missing ledger page," she blurted. The room went still. I straightened. We hadn't told her about any missing paperwork. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. He leaned forward, slow and deliberate, as though savouring the moment. "Indeed. The missing ledger page. Curious that you know of it, when I have not mentioned it in your presence." Colour drained from her face. I must have heard Kelland mention it." "No," Wolfe cut in, voice iron. "You could not have. He did not. You have knowledge you should not. That betrays you." Her breath came quick, shallow. She looked at me, almost pleading, but my raised brows told her she was cooked. "Mrs. Harrow," Wolfe continued, tone rising like a tide, "the page vanished from the firm's records long before Kelland began whispering. Only someone intimate with those affairs could know. Only someone who had a hand in its removal." She shook her head. "I didn't." "You did," Wolfe thundered. His hand slammed down on the arm of his chair, rattling the beer glass. "Do not dissemble with me. You sought to protect your husband's reputation, perhaps your own comfort, by erasing what could not be erased. And when Kelland discovered enough to endanger you, you sought to silence him, not with your hands, but with complicity." Her voice cracked. "I never killed him." "No," Wolfe said coldly. "You did not soil your hands, but you set events in motion. You consorted with men capable of violence. You leaned upon others to do what you would not. And thus, a man lies strangled in an alley, his tie a garrote." I added, "And now you're here, tripping over yourself, and naming ledger pages like you've been rehearsing the script." Her eyes flashed at me, then filled with tears. She turned back to Wolfe. "I was desperate. Do you understand what ruin would mean? Everything gone, his legacy, my security. They would strip me bare in the papers. I thought, if the page disappeared, perhaps the rest would remain hidden. But Kelland, he kept copies, notes. He wanted more, always more. I didn't know he'd be killed." Wolfe's glare softened only slightly. "Desperation is not absolution. You tampered with truth, and truth, once tampered, corrodes." The silence that followed was broken only by the tick of the clock and the distant hum of traffic outside. Fritz's dinner cooled in the dining room, forgotten. The trap had been sprung, and Genevieve sat caught, trembling in the red chair. Finally, Wolfe exhaled, long and slow. He lifted his beer, drained it, and set the glass down with deliberate finality. "Archie, note this. Mrs. Harrow has confessed to knowledge of the missing ledger page. That alone implicates her beyond coincidence. We will act accordingly." I pulled out my notebook, scribbled, and said, "Noted, though I doubt Kramer will appreciate the neat bow on the package." "He will not," Wolfe agreed, "but he will have to accept it." Genevieve whispered, "What will you do with me?" Wolfe's gaze was steady. "What I must. You will remain under scrutiny. I will not yet deliver you to Inspector Kramer, not until I have the whole skein. But be assured, madam, you are enmeshed. Attempt no deceit. It will avail you nothing." She covered her face with her hands, silent. Wolfe rang the bell for Fritz. A moment later, Fritz entered, collected the untouched glasses, and with quiet efficiency announced that the roast duck had cooled beyond rescue. Wolfe waved him away, uninterested. That alone told you how deep his fury ran. As Genevieve left, I walked her to the door. She moved like a woman under water, dignity shredded, fear clinging to her like a second dress. When the door closed behind her, I stood in the hall for a moment, listening to the muted city outside. Then I returned to the office. Wolfe sat immovable, eyes closed, lips pressed thin. The letter still lay on his desk, the warning folded like a blade. The air in the office was thick, heavy with orchids, roasted herbs, and the scent of a trap well sprung. I poured myself another glass of milk, raised it toward him, and said, "One down, boss, but I have a hunch there's more coming." He didn't answer, but his silence carried the weight of inevitability. The brownstone at night could fool you into thinking it was unshakable. Outside, Manhattan was all neon burn and sirens, but inside the walls were thick, the drapes heavy, and the air carried only the scents Fritz wanted. Garlic softening in a pan, herbs clipped fresh from pots he kept jealously in the kitchen. Wolfe had eaten his dinner at 8 sharp, of course, and now he was planted in the yellow chair, a book balanced against his stomach and a glass of beer sweating beside him. I was at my desk, half pretending to sort mail and half dozing. It was near 11 when the phone rang. The sound cut through the house like a razor, sharp and deliberate. Wolfe's eyes flicked up, narrowed. He never reached for the phone if I was in the room, so it was on me. I lifted the receiver. "Nero Wolfe's residence, Archie Goodwin speaking." The voice came soft, even, but with a current under it that chilled. "You can't protect her, or yourself." The whisper was different from the first, less frantic, more amused, mocking. "Who is this?" I demanded, pressing the receiver tight. A soft chuckle. "You'll see soon enough." The line went dead. I stood there, the hum of the dial tone filling the silence like a sneer. Wolfe's voice rumbled across the office. "Well?" "Encore performance," I said. Only this time he's calmer. Said I can't protect her, or myself. Sounded like he was enjoying the show. Wolfe's mouth compressed into a thin line. "Trace." "I'm already moving," I said, grabbing my hat. In 1940s Manhattan, tracing a call wasn't like flipping a switch. You had to lean on contacts who owed you, and I had a few. By the time I'd wrangled a location from a sleepy operator and a friend in the exchange, it pointed me toward a midtown boarding house on a street that never saw daylight. The cab dropped me off in front of it, a narrow, grim building with peeling paint and a flickering hallway light that buzzed like an angry wasp. The entrance smelled of old cabbage and wet newspapers. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the address and room number scribbled in my pocket. The hall was a tunnel of faded carpet and warped doors. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar. From inside came the faint creak of a phone receiver swinging on its cord. I drew my gun, not because I expected a shootout, but because rooms that smell like whispers usually come with trouble. I pushed the door open with my foot. The room was bare, almost insulting in its poverty. A single bed with a lumpy mattress, a rickety dresser with one drawer half open, and a chair tilted against the wall. The only movement was the telephone receiver, still swaying, its cord twisting as it clicked against the table. I crossed the room quickly, picked it up. Dead air. Whoever had called me had hung up seconds before I arrived. I scanned the room fast. No suitcase, no clothes, no photographs. The bed was unmade but not slept in. On the dresser sat a glass with water gone stale, a cigarette stubbed out in a chipped saucer. The ash was still warm. "Damn," I muttered. I'd missed him by minutes. I crouched, checked under the bed, then in the closet. Empty. A single wire hanger swung, squeaking on its rod. The window was cracked. I moved to it, pushed it open. It looked out onto a fire escape slick with rain, the street 2 stories below. Water glistened on the iron rails. Whoever had been here could have slipped out the moment I hit the stairs. I stood for a long minute listening. The city's sounds filtered in, horns, a distant shout, tires hissing through puddles, but nothing close. The accomplice was gone, vanished into the night. I searched the room again, slower this time. No papers, no notes, no matches from nightclubs. The only thing resembling a clue was the faint indentation on the table where someone had pressed a pen hard against paper. No sheet remained, just the ghost of writing, invisible to anyone who didn't look close. I memorized the lay of it, though it was too faint to read. Then I lifted the receiver again, put it back on its cradle. The silence after the click was louder than noise. I left the room as I found it, except for the taste of unease it left in my mouth. Back at the Brownstone, Wolfe was waiting naturally, not having moved except to pour himself a fresh beer. He raised his eyes when I entered, wet from rain and more than a little sour. "Well," he said. "Boarding house in Midtown. Room was stripped clean. Only sign of life was the phone still swinging when I walked in. Whoever it was, they ducked out while I was on the stairs. Fast operator." "No occupant?" "None worth noting. Bed barely touched, no luggage. Just a glass, a cigarette, and an empty closet. He travelled light." Wolfe's fingers drummed the arm of his chair. "So, not Mrs. Harrow?" "Definitely not." Voice was different, and I'd bet the rent it's an accomplice. Somebody covering tracks, making sure we know we're being watched as much as we're watching. "Indeed." He reached for the letter on his desk, the one pulled from Kellan's pocket. He set it beside him, eyes narrowing. "This strengthens my hypothesis. The threats are not random. They are orchestrated, deliberate, a campaign." "Yeah," I said, sinking into my chair. "And right now, the campaign's winning. We've got one corpse, a missing client, and whispers that lead to empty rooms. You want Saul to nose around the boarding house. Of course, he will see what your haste could not. But the essential fact remains," he tapped the letter. "They seek to cow me, in my house. It is unacceptable." I smirked. "Funny thing, boss. I think they know that's the quickest way to get under your skin." He glared, but only mildly. "Archie, summon Mr. Panzer, and tomorrow you will pay a visit to the Whisper Room proprietor. Mrs. Harrow's name in their books is not accident. We must prise open that shell." "Got it," I said. "And what about Kramer? He'll love hearing about another whisperer phoning in death threats while I run across town." "Phooey, Kramer may wait. His bluster clouds more than it clarifies." I leaned back, watching Wolfe reach for his beer. The rain outside had settled into a steady rhythm, tapping against the glass like a drummer marking time. The Brownstone held steady, but for the first time in years, I felt the cracks in the fortress. The whisperer hadn't just called to threaten. He'd called to prove a point, that he could reach inside the Brownstone, shake it from the shadows, and vanish into the night without leaving more than a swaying receiver. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that a whisper can echo louder than a shout, especially when it comes just before the storm breaks. Boarding houses in Midtown don't improve with daylight. At night they're seedy, but in the morning they're just plain pitiful, no shadows left to disguise the rot. Saul Panzer and I had returned to Kellan's lodgings with a key procured by methods Saul didn't elaborate on and I didn't ask about. With Saul, you don't ask. You just let him work and enjoy the results. The hall smelled of boiled cabbage and shoe leather, a perfume every bit as unpleasant as it sounds. We climbed to the second floor, our shoes creaking against linoleum that had been laid back when Harding was president. Saul moved like a shadow in his old flat cap, eyes sweeping corners, hands calm and steady. He paused at the door to Kellan's room, glanced at me and murmured, "Quiet." Then he turned the key and eased it open. The room was as shabby as the rent suggested, a bed with a sagging mattress, a table scarred from too many elbows, a dresser that looked like it had been rejected by goodwill. Dust coated everything, but there were signs Kellan hadn't been entirely careless. Papers stacked neatly in a corner, a locked trunk shoved under the bed. Saul knelt immediately at the trunk, produced a small pick, and in less than a minute had it open. I'll say this about Saul: if he ever decided to retire from detective work, he could have made a fortune as a burglar. Inside the trunk were bundles of ledgers, loose sheets, and notebooks scrawled with Kellan's cramped handwriting. "Jackpot," I muttered. Saul didn't smile, he never does, but he pulled out a sheaf of papers, flipping through them with methodical precision. "Look for inserts," he said. I moved to the stack in the corner, thumbing through ledgers until my fingers caught on a sheet that didn't match the rest. It was tucked between pages, folded, the edges worn like it had been handled often but hidden deliberately. I drew it out and flattened it on the table. There it was, the missing ledger page. The ink was faded, but the meaning was loud. Numbers, accounts, and signatures that tied together like a knot, and not the kind sailors brag about. The embezzlement was clear, money siphoned through dummy accounts, redirected into places it didn't belong. And below the neat columns, scrawled in a hand I recognized from other samples, were the signatures of not only Harrow, but Genevieve herself. I let out a low whistle. Well, looks like our widow had more than a front row seat. She was signing off the act. Saul leaned in, eyes narrow. Forgery. I shook my head. Not unless she was forging her own name. No, this is her, clean as day. She wasn't just the grieving spouse covering a dead man's tracks. She was in it with him. Saul tapped the margin where Kelland had scribbled notes. He knew. Yeah, I said grimly, and that's why he whispered. The triumph of finding the page soured quickly into unease. It was proof, sure, proof that could topple Genevieve's defences and shred her pretense of innocence, but it also made her dangerous. A cornered woman with money, reputation, and now blood in her orbit wasn't just going to fold politely. We packed the sheet carefully, sliding it into an envelope Saul produced. He replaced the rest of the papers with the same precision he'd used to open the trunk. When we left the room, it looked no different, except lighter by one very important page. The walk back down the hall felt heavier than the climb up. My thoughts churned. Genevieve had slipped in Wolfe's office by mentioning the missing page, but this was the nail. The fact she'd risked her own hand in the ledger meant the blackmail wasn't about her husband's sins alone. It was about hers. We hailed a cab and rode back through streets slick with morning drizzle. Saul stayed silent, eyes scanning the city through the rain-speckled glass, cap low. Me, I couldn't help running the possibilities in my head. If Genevieve had killed Kelland, she'd been efficient. But if she hadn't, if someone else had decided to tidy the loose end, then we had another hand in the game, one with access to the same rotten page we now carried. The Brownstone smelled of Fritz's kitchen when we entered. He was pulling something miraculous from the oven, judging by the warm drift of butter and herbs that greeted us in the hall. Wolfe was already in the office, orchids done for the morning, bulk settled in the yellow chair, hands folded. When I placed the envelope on his desk, his eyes sharpened like a hawk spotting prey. "Report," he commanded. I told him. Saul's lockpicking, the trunk, the papers, the page. His eyes never left the envelope. Finally, he unfolded it, smoothed the sheet, and began to read. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint clink of his glass as Fritz entered to set down the midday beer. Wolfe read line by line, eyes narrowing, until at last he grunted. As I suspected, embezzlement, subterfuge, and Mrs. Harrow's hand is here, irrefutable. He tapped the page with one thick finger. This is the fulcrum, the lever upon which everything turns. Yeah, I said, sipping the milk Fritz had thoughtfully provided, and a lever heavy enough to smash Genevieve's alibi to powder. Saul stood silent, but his eyes flicked toward Wolfe, waiting. Wolfe considered, then leaned back, steepling his fingers. This, Wolfe said, will bring her to heel, but it also clarifies Kelland's death. He possessed this page. He intended to use it. Therefore, he was silenced. By her? I asked. Wolfe shook his head. No, Mrs. Harrow is not devoid of guile, but she is not adept at murder. Her hands are too refined, her nerves too brittle. No, another hand executed Kelland. She merely set the stage through folly and concealment. Saul spoke at last, voice low. An accomplice. Wolfe nodded once. Precisely. I set my glass down. So, we've got Genevieve, tied to her husband's dirty books, Kelland, strangled because he had the page, and someone else strong enough to pull a tie tight and smart enough to vanish. That narrows it. Barely. Wolfe reached for his beer, drank and set it down with care. It is sufficient. We now have substance, not whispers. With this we may compel. I grinned. Meaning what? We wave this page under Genevieve's nose and see if she faints. Meaning, Wolfe said, voice deep and deliberate, we wait. She will come again. She must. When she does, we will present her with the truth she cannot deny, and we will observe who trembles. Saul slipped his hands into his pockets, cap shadowing his eyes. I'll keep watch on the boarding house, see if anyone returns for what's missing. Excellent, Wolfe said. Your discretion is invaluable. Saul nodded once and left as quietly as he had arrived. The office settled again, the page lying on Wolfe's desk like a weapon. He stared at it as if memorizing every line, every column of figures. Outside, the city roared on, uncaring, but inside the Brownstone we had turned a corner. The whispers were over. The ledger spoke, and it spoke volumes. For my part, I leaned back in my chair, watching Wolfe's eyes gleam in the lamplight, and thought about Genevieve in her silk dresses and brittle poise. The next time she sat in that red chair, she wouldn't be able to glide past with denials. She'd have to face her own signature, staring back at her in black ink. And when Wolfe laid it out, she'd crumble, or she'd fight. Either way, it was going to be one hell of a show. The Brownstone is no stranger to theatrics, but when Wolfe decides to stage a finale, he makes the Metropolitan Opera look like a vaudeville tryout. The summons had gone out early that morning, hand-delivered by me to the reluctant participants. By late afternoon, the pieces were in place. All that remained was the conductor's cue. The office was set as carefully as a stage. Wolfe sat squarely in the yellow chair, a glass of beer sweating on the stand beside him. He'd timed it so his orchids had had their 2 hours. Fritz had fed him properly, and his brain was sharpened for combat. The red chairs were arranged in a row across from him like witness stands. Outside, rain drummed a steady beat against the windows, tapping time for the drama about to unfold. Kramer was first to arrive, chewing a cigar as if it might confess something. He stormed in, ignoring me, and planted himself in one of the red chairs with the belligerent flop of a man determined not to enjoy himself. He smelled faintly of tobacco and police station sweat, and his eyes narrowed as though Wolfe's rug had committed a crime. "Wolfe," he growled, "this better be good." "It will be," Wolfe said simply, without lifting his gaze from the papers arranged on his desk. Next came Genevieve Harrow, ushered in by me. She was a study in defiance draped in silk, black again, pearls at her throat, eyes flashing like she thought sheer indignation could keep her afloat. She sat stiffly, back straight, gloved hands folded on her lap. "You said you had answers," she said, her voice brittle but steady. "Then say them." Saul Pantzer slipped in last, quiet as a shadow. He didn't take a chair. He leaned against the wall, cap low, hands in pockets, watchful. He wasn't there for theatrics, but as insurance. My kind of insurance, the kind you thank later when you still have a pulse. I shut the door and stayed on my feet by Wolfe's desk, ready to play referee if needed. Wolfe finally looked up. His eyes travelled slowly across them all. Kramer's simmering glare, Genevieve's tight mask, Saul's still calm, before settling back on the papers. He tapped one thick finger on the top sheet. "This," he said, "is the missing ledger page." Genevieve twitched, just slightly, the pearls at her throat quivering. Kramer leaned forward, chewing harder. Saul didn't move a muscle. "It demonstrates," Wolfe continued, "the systematic siphoning of funds from Harrow and Company through dummy accounts, then into personal holdings. The figures are plain, the signatures are plainer. Mr. Harrow's hand, of course, but also," he lifted the page, peered, then dropped it back with disdain, "Mrs. Harrow's, hers repeatedly." Genevieve's voice cracked. "Lies." "Phooey." Wolfe's tone cut the word in half. "It is ink, madam, not invention. You cannot deny it. You may, however, explain it." She began, but Kramer bulldozed over her. "So she was in it, up to her neck." He slapped his knee. "I knew it. That club account, the witnesses, hell, it all fits." "No, Inspector," Wolfe said coolly. "You knew nothing. You suspected. You raged. But you did not know. I know. And now you shall too." He shifted, folding his hands across his vast middle. Mrs. Harrow was not content to sit as a grieving widow. She preserved her comforts by joining her husband in his fraud. When he died, she sought to bury the evidence, hence the missing page. She enlisted Morton Kelland, a discarded law clerk, to aid her in suppressing it. Genevieve shot to her feet. "That's not true. Sit," Wolfe thundered. She sat. "Kelland," Wolfe went on, "proved less docile than she expected. Having seen the ledger, he realized he could wield it. He became her blackmailer. He whispered threats, demanded money, shadowed her movements. But he miscalculated. He believed she was weak. In truth, she is merely cautious, so she sought aid." His gaze fixed on her like a pin through an insect. She turned to the proprietor of the Whisper Room. Kramer jerked upright. "The nightclub owner? You're saying—" "Yes. Kelland was strangled not by Mrs. Harrow, but by a hand more accustomed to such work. A hand attached to a man with the means to silence him permanently in exchange for Mrs. Harrow's patronage and payments. That is why she maintained her account there, Inspector, not for champagne, but for murder." The room went silent but for the rain. Genevieve's voice came in a whisper, ragged now. "You can't prove it." Wolfe leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Madam, I need not prove it to you. I need only to demonstrate it to Inspector Kramer. You, however, have already betrayed yourself. You mentioned the missing page before it was revealed to you. You displayed knowledge you could not have possessed unless you had handled it. That was your slip, and now the page itself condemns you." Kramer slapped the arm of his chair, the cigar bouncing between his teeth. "That's enough for me. You're coming downtown, lady." Genevieve's composure cracked. She turned on Wolfe, eyes blazing. You smug, gluttonous tyrant. You sit in your chair and destroy lives with words." Wolfe's voice was a glacier. "I expose what already destroys them. You destroyed your own when you chose deceit. I merely illuminate it." Kramer was already on his feet, motioning to the uniforms waiting in the hall. They entered, cuffs ready. Genevieve rose slowly, dignity clinging to her like perfume gone stale. She didn't fight. She didn't cry. She only looked at me once, eyes full of something between fury and plea. I gave her nothing back. When the door closed behind them, silence settled again. Saul tipped his cap slightly, then slipped out without a word. His part was done. I turned to Wolfe. He was leaning back, reaching for his beer, face calm as though he'd just concluded a lecture on orchids instead of handing a woman over to justice. "Well," I said, "that was tidy. A little too tidy. You're sure the nightclub owner strangled Kelland?" "Reason dictates," Wolfe said after a sip. Mrs. Harrow lacked the nerve. Kelland's death was swift, professional. She commissioned it, perhaps even suggested it, but she did not execute it. That distinction will matter little to the law, though much to the truth. "Kramer seemed happy enough," I said. "Might even buy you a drink some day." "Phooey," Wolfe muttered. "He will return tomorrow, grumbling, seeking flaws. Let him. For now my task is complete." He drained his glass and set it down with a thump. Fritz entered silently, collecting the empties, already planning dinner. I sat at my desk, watching Wolfe settle deeper into his chair, eyes closing, the storm outside easing to a drizzle. That was the reckoning. Wolfe had pulled the threads together, tied the bow, and handed it to Kramer with all the grace of a man who despises being interrupted during mealtime. And yet, under the surface calm, I knew it gnawed at him. The audacity of the whispers, the breach of the Brownstone sanctity. But the fortress still stood, and as long as Wolfe had his chair, his beer, and his orchids, no whisper in Manhattan could topple it. There's something about a case ending that doesn't quite feel like an ending. Sure, the papers will scream the next morning, "Widow arrested in Ledger murder," or some other headline that sells more copies than it should. Kramer will pound his chest at the press conference, chewing his cigar down to a nub while insisting he cracked it with nothing but grit and guesswork. Saul will vanish back into the folds of the city, his flat cap the last I'll see of him until the next dirty job needs clean hands. But here in the Brownstone, when the dust settles, it's a different show altogether. That night, the house had a hush about it, the kind that sinks into the rugs and makes the lamps glow softer than usual. Outside, Manhattan was its usual circus, horns, laughter, an occasional drunk arguing with the rain, but the thick walls of West 35th Street held the chaos at bay. Inside, we were three men returning to habit, which is Wolfe's favourite word next to beer. Dinner had been at 8 sharp, as it always is. Fritz served duck. He swore it wasn't the same duck we let cool during Genevieve's slip-up, though I had my suspicions he'd turned leftovers into magic again. He brought it in with roasted potatoes, green beans that snapped just right, and a sauce so rich even Wolfe paused between forkfuls to hum his approval. I had my fill, naturally, though I noticed Wolfe kept circling back to the potatoes, nudging Fritz for seconds as if a man of his size needed encouragement. Now it was late. Fritz had retreated downstairs, the kitchen secured like a kingdom gone to rest. Wolfe was in the yellow chair, a heavy book balanced on his stomach. I didn't bother to check the title. It was probably something Latin that only 12 men in the city cared to read. The desk lamp made a neat circle around him, leaving the corners of the office in soft shadow. The orchids upstairs had long since had their 2-hour sermon, and the faint ghost of their perfume still clung to his clothes. I was at my usual post. Desk, notebook shut, glass of milk in hand. I don't care how many times I've been ribbed for it. Milk tastes better at the end of a case. Beer is Wolf's nightcap, milk is mine. He likes to call it childish, I call it clarity. And when you've spent days wading through corpses, whispers and widows in silk, clarity isn't a bad thing to drink. The case had started with a whisper. Thin, frantic, afraid. It had turned into a different whisper, mocking, sharp, meant to rattle the Brownstone's walls. And in the end, it had been Genevieve herself who whispered too much, her tongue slipping in our office like a foot on wet cobblestone. Now the whispers were gone, carried off by the law and whatever Kramer planned to wring out of her at headquarters. Wolfe hadn't spoken in half an hour. That wasn't unusual. His silences are like boulders. You climb over them, or you sit and wait. Tonight I let him have it. I leaned back, listened to the rain patter against the glass, and thought about all the places the whispers had led me. The whisper room, velvet booths, smoke curling like snakes, jazz bleeding from the stage. Kellan's alley, his tie wound around his throat like the world's worst neckwear decision. The boarding house, empty but for a swaying phone. Genevieve's pearls quivering when Wolfe caught her slip. And finally, Kramer, storming out of here with his prisoner and looking like he'd bitten into a lemon that bit back. I grinned into my milk. Whispers never pay rent, I said aloud, mostly to myself. Wolfe looked up from his book. What? Nothing, I said. Just thinking how funny it is. Somebody thought they could shake this house with a few words over a wire. But whispers don't pay rent, and the Brownstone doesn't scare. Phooey, Wolfe muttered, returning to his book. But I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. That's as close as he gets to laughing at my jokes. I stretched out, let the quiet fill me. Cases end with noise, sirens, headlines, handcuffs, but they settle with silence. It's in the silence that you feel the Brownstone steady again, its walls thick with routine. Wolfe will still rise at breakfast, orchids from 9 to 11, lunch at 1, beer at 6, dinner at 8. Fritz will still guard the kitchen like a Swiss general. And me, I'll still open the door to clients who think their troubles are unique until they find themselves sinking into Wolfe's red chair. But every case leaves a trace. This one left more than whispers. It left me remembering Genevieve's eyes when she realized Wolfe had cornered her, that flash of fury and plea all tangled together. It left me thinking about Kelland, a nervous law clerk who thought blackmail was a ticket to the good life, and ended with his tie around his neck in an alley puddle. It left me hearing that phone still swinging in the empty boarding house room, like a pendulum marking time we couldn't catch. I don't kid myself. This city's full of voices, most of them whispering things you don't want to hear. But when one dares to whisper against Wolfe, they forget one thing. Wolfe doesn't bend. Not to whispers, not to threats, not to anyone. He closed his book with a snap. That was his signal the evening was done. He drained the last of his beer, rang the little bell for Fritz, and leaned back, eyelids already heavy. Fritz appeared within moments, as if conjured, to clear the glass and offer Wolfe his nightly cordial. I got a look from Fritz that said he expected me to head upstairs soon too, but I lingered. I liked the feel of the house when it was only us three, the world outside muffled and distant. The Brownstone had been threatened, sure, but it stood. It always stands. I finished my milk, set the glass down, and stood. "Good night, boss," I said. Wolfe grunted, already half asleep. I went upstairs, the quiet wrapping me like a coat. The whispers were gone, the case was closed, and the Brownstone was secure again. Tomorrow there would be another knock, another red chair filled, another tangle to unwind. But for tonight, the fortress had held, and the silence was ours.